This is Gemara in Kesubos, Daf Yomi, and we're holding on the bottom of Lamed Chesamid Beis, 6 lines from the bottom. Amar Abaya, continuing the halachas of the halachas of one who violates a woman, as we began the parak of Elu Nairos, the Chamishim Shekel Kesef, teaches Abaya Boa Lo Umesa. What is the halacha if someone violates this girl, the girl who was a Naira, the girl who was a Besula, as the pasuk taught us, but then the girl was nifter before the man paid? We learned from the pasuk, what's the halacha? We learned from the pasuk, the halacha is if someone violates a naira besula, he pays chamishim shekel kesef to whom? To the father. But what is the halacha if the girl is nifter before the man goes to court and has to pay to the father? The halacha, it says, Abai is pater. Why? Shenemar, the pasuk says, as we just quoted outside, v'nasan lavia naira. You have to give the father of the naira. But if there's no naira here because she is nifter, no longer do you have to pay the chamishim shekel kesef. Says the Gemara, Abaye just said a din that's davar pashit. That if the girl is nifter, you don't have to pay. Rava asked this as a shayla. Rava asked, Yesh bagar bekever ein bagar bekever. Asked Rava, is there a din of becoming a bagros, of reaching the age of 12 and a half after one is nifter, or not? What does that mean? Explains the Gemara. Yesh bagar bekever ubedivna have. Do we say that a woman reaches the age of a bagros in the kever, and therefore the money goes to the child? Meaning, if the person has to pay after the girl would have been already 12 and a half, now is it going to go to the child, or will it still go to the father? If anyone's confused, don't worry, the Gemara is about to explain a bit deeper. Omima Abra, ask the Gemara in the top of Lam Tesam and Aleph, I don't understand. How can it be that there's a child? She was nifter. And we're asking more particularly that the case is that the girl was an Naira. If the case of the girl was an Naira, as we're about to see, she cannot have given birth. Why? Because Rav Nachman teaches us there are 3 women that are allowed to be meshamish b'moich, allowed to use a cloth to prevent themselves from becoming pregnant. Eluain, due to the sakana involved, ketana muberes menika, a ketana, a girl who's underage, a muberes, a woman that's pregnant, menika, a woman who is nursing. These 3 women are allowed to use some sort of birth control because for them to get pregnant is the sakana. Ketana Hashem tisaber, like we just said, v'tamas, and she might be nifter. Muberes Hashem tase ubra sandal, maybe it will destroy the current fetus. Menika Hashem tigmal espano, cause her to wean her child, which Bizman Chazal for sure was a sakana to the child. Veizo kitana. What is a kitana? Says that the Brisa explicitly, what is a kitana? From 11 to 12. Pachais mikan v'yaser alkein, less than 11 or more than 12. Then mishameshes gedarkov alechas divi Rameir. Then Rameir says she's allowed to be mishamesh regularly. It's no longer a sakana if she's under 11 or more than 12. V'chachamim ma'imrim achazu v'achazu mishamesh gedarkov alechas. In both cases, she's allowed to have relations regularly. And in heaven they'll take care of her. Misham shenemar shemer b'sleim Hashem. As Hashem takes care of the simple, Hashem takes care perhaps of the fool. However you translate it. So ask the Gemara, if we're discussing in our case a Naira, how can it be that she had a child? If we're seeing over here that it's not a possibility. Maybe you'll tell me, remember, the case is, someone violated this girl while she was a Naira, between 12 and 12 and a half. And then she was nifter before she became the age of 12 and a half. So the Gemara is assuming right now, when did she have to have been pregnant? Before she was 12, while she was a ketana. That's the Gemara's question. Can't be, we just saw girls under the age of 12 don't become pregnant. Suggests the Gemara, maybe no. Maybe she became pregnant while she was a Naira, meaning once she became 12 years of age, and maybe she gave birth even while she was a Naira. Says the Gemara, but how could that be? You're only a Naira, could you give birth in 6 months? You're only a Naira for 6 months, from 12 to 12 and a half. So the Gemara is bothered The Gemara is bothered. What is this case that a man violates a girl who was an Naira, who was 12, and now we're trying to figure out, according to Rabbah, whether there's Bagros Bekever, whether she now would have been 12 and a half. Does the money go to her son? Does the money go to the father? How could she have a son? And maybe he'll suggest maybe he'll tell me that Shmuel only means that there's a minimum of 6 months as an Naira, but you could have more than 6 months. Ha'ela kamar. He says, Ein bein nair lebagros ela shisha chadashim. There's only 6 months. So the Gemara is very bothered. How can we have a case of someone violating a naira and there ends up being a child? Ela hachi kami ba'ilei. So now we're going back. What did Rava mean? Again, we started off today, then Milsa de Pshita Leila Abaye. That which was Pasha to Abaye is a Shaila to Rava. What's the Shaila of Rava of Yesh Bagger Bekever? Ein Bagger Bekever explains the Gemara. Yesh Bagger Bekever upaka av. Oitilma Ein Bagger Bekever v'loi paka av. That was the Shaila. That if one violates a Naira, and then she is Nifter, and now she would have been 12 and a half years of age, does the money still go to the father or not? Mar Baravashi asked the question as follows: Misa isabagros, eino isabagros. Does one become a bageres after Misa or not? Take when we do not have an answer, and that's din number 1 of today, the din that it generally goes to the father, and now the shaila is, but what happens after she's nifter, if the father still retains that right or not? And again, Abaya learned that Nasan Lavi Hanaira, he learned this straight from a pasuk of Milsa de Pshitale, V'lo Yavi Hameisa, that you only give the fine to the father of the Naira, but if she's nifter, you don't have to give it anymore. Whereas Rava, and by extension, Mar Baravashi asked it as a Shaila didn't think it was, so Pashit. And we continue with another Shaila about 15 lines down. First one in line is by Gares. Ba Yimine Rava Me Abaya. Rava asked Abaya the following Shaila. Ba Lev in his Arsamahu. What happens if someone is Baal a Naira, someone forces the Naira to have relations, and then what? And then the girl became engaged to someone else before this man paid. Again, case number 1 today was someone violates a girl and she's nifter. Abaye said you don't pay the father. Rava's not sure. Case number 2 is person violates a girl and then she gets engaged. What's the halacha now? Amar le. So Abaye responds to Rava. Does it say in the pasuk you have to give to the father of the nair that's not engaged? Doesn't say that. It just says that at the time of the relation she had to have been asher loy oirasa, that she was not engaged. But it doesn't say she's currently not engaged. So it says Abaye l'chayri you should still pay the father. But Rava says back, according to that which you're teaching me, Abaya, Haditanya, that which says in the Brisa Baal Lev in Isses, if someone violates her and then she gets married, le'atzma, we pay the money straight to her. It doesn't say it. It doesn't say you only have to give it to the father if she's not married. And yet we know that that's the halacha. Says the Abaya, whoa, slow down, Rava. Hachiyashta. Ha samahayalu bagros moitzi amirshas av. Vinisu in moitzi amirshas av. Says Abaya, there's a general common denominator between her getting married, nisuin, and bagros. Just like once she reaches the age of 12 and a half, she's no longer in the possession of the father. So too, if she has nisuin, if she has a full-fledged marriage, she's no longer in the possession of the father. And that's the reason why the kanas goes to herself. That's the reason, explains Abaye, that just like if she becomes a begeris when she's of 12 and a half years old, the fine goes directly to her, she's out of the rishus of the father. So too, if she got married, she would get the money. But says Abaye, that doesn't bring me a raya to Erisin. Ela Erisin, mikam afker rishus adav. Does Erisin take her out of the rishus of the father? Says the Gemara, Mika Mafkil Shazal Av Legamri. Hatinan, we learned in the Mishnah, Naira Murasa Avio Baila Mefir Lanidirel. She's still partially in the Shus of the father. Proof in the pudding that if she makes a neder, both her father or her future husband, her arusa, could be made for the neder. So it's Baya sticks by a shaila. Again, so we're ending off the Baya as a shaila in this case. What happens is someone violates a girl and she accepts Erisin. If she accepts Nisuin, if she becomes 12 and a half years old, everyone agrees the fine goes to herself, because at this point she leaves the rishus of the father. And therefore Abaye says to Rav, what you answered me is not an answer, because I'm asking specifically on Eirisin, and Eirisin is still partially rishus of the father. As we know, the father can still be made for Nadarim. Who would get the fine? And we leave it at that. Says the Mishnah on the bottom of Lametesam and Aleph, someone who seduces a woman has to pay her three things. Is someone who forcefully has relations with a woman, he rapes her, he has to pay her four things. What does he have to pay her? He has to pay her boishes, humiliation, pegam, that which her value depreciates, ukinas, and a fine. If someone violates her forcefully, she has to pay for the pain that is involved. Says the Gemishna, what is the difference between oinis and mafate, between forceful violation and seducing? A bit repetitive. You have to pay right away. And mafate, when do you pay? You pay when she leaves, when you send her away, as we'll see in the Gemara. The Oynes has to drink literally from his pot. As we're going to learn what that means is, the halacha is, if someone violates a girl, if someone is ma'anes her, he's a chiv to marry her. If he seduces her, he doesn't have to. If it's consensual, if she agrees to relations, then he's allowed to send her away. As we just explained, what does it mean? She drinks from his pot. Even if she's lame, even if she's blind, even if she's covered with boils, the halacha is that he has to marry her. But let's say we find a lewd matter about her. Let's say she's not allowed to come into being a yid. Then ain't a rashay lekam. Then he's not allowed to stay married to her. Isha be fit for her. So if she's fit for him, just she has a physical deformity, a physical imperfection, then the halacha is if someone is ma'anes, if forcefully has relations with a woman, he's forced to marry her. But if he just seduces her, if it's consensual, then he's allowed to send her away. And let's see the Gemara. So again, we're now discussing the difference between pitoy and oines, forceful versus seduction. And the Mishnah said primarily there's 3 versus 4. Pitoy is tsar, pagam, and kenas, whereas oines I said that incorrectly. Pitoy is boishes, pagam, and kenas, whereas oines has the additional tsar. Says the Gemara, tsar de mai. What is the case of tsar? What tsar do you pay for? We're saying in the case of oines, when it's forceful relations, he has to pay her for the pain. What's the pain? The pain is that he acted forcefully with her. He threw her on the ground. That's the tsar he has to pay to her. Maskler of Zera asked her of Zera, are you telling me it's subjective? That the case of Tsar is only in a case that he acted forcefully with her, he threw her on the ground. But let's say he was Chavta al Gabi Shirayim, he threw onto silk, he threw onto a nice comfy bed. You're telling me there's no Tsar? It can't be. The Mishnah is a din that's absolute. The Mishnah says in every case of Ainis, it's a din of Tsar. So how are you telling me that it's subjective whether there is physical pain in the surrounding act or not? People say, no, it's true. If you put her on a comfy bed, a couch, or silk, then there is no tsar. Can't be. Why does that? He argues and he says, Oines does not pay the pain. Why not? As we turn over to Lamites Amid Beis, says if Shimon Yehuda, you know why Oines doesn't have to pay tsar? He argues on our din because it's gonna be tsar anyways under the husband. So now we're seeing what the tsar is. Because if Shimon Yehuda is arguing saying you don't pay for tsar, because there will be this tsar under the husband. So Amar Loi and the Chachamim respond to Shimon Yehuda, there's no dimion, there's no comparison between forceful relations to willingful relationships. So we see clearly that the tsar that we're talking about is not a simple tsar of putting someone on a bed or putting someone on his silk. As we're seeing this clearly a machlek in the Shimon Yehuda and the Chachamim, what this tsar is. So explains the Gemara, Elo Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Ravua tsar shal pisag raglayim. There's an inherent tsar. The tsar, when he separates when she separates her legs, when during the act of relationship, during the act of tashmish, and that is the payment of tsar. But as the pasuk says, you spread your legs to everyone that goes by. But ask the Gemara the obvious kasha: if it's the pain of the act of intercourse, that's every type of intercourse, whether it's consensual or not. So the Mishnah told me there's only a din of tzar. By oines, if you're explaining to me that what is the tzar, what is the pain, that the actual act of intercourse is painful for the woman, so then it should be the same thing by mefuta. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Ravua, Mashal de mefuta l'mad davar daime. He explains, no, you got it wrong. What is mefuta? What is seduction analogous to? La'adam shamar lecha ve'roi karish shirayim shalivi pater. That someone says to his friend, tear up my silk and be pater. Meaning, it's true there is some level of pain, but it's consensual, so it's not the same. Shali, says the Gemara, is it go to me? Tavuninu, but the pain goes to the father. El Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Ravu, let's change the mashal a little bit. Pilchai shabeno imarais mafuta ein lahen sar. The Pichais, the wise woman, explain that the mafuta, that when someone is seduced, there is no pain of separating your legs. Ask Lima, what do you mean? But we know it's not true. We know that the woman does experience some level of pain during intercourse. Amar Abaye, Amar Li'em, Abaye repeats from his mother, it's like hot water on a bald head. And Rava Amar Amar Libas, Rav Chista, who's his wife, Ki Rivda de Kasilta, it's like the lancet puncture of a bloodletter, the little prick. Rababa Amar Amar Libas, Abba Surya, Kinama, Kushe Bechinchi, like a hard bread rubbing against your mouth. All these things are minor pains. And what does it mean they're minor pains? They're minor in relationship to the entire act that is going on over here. That it's true. There is a little bit of pain, as the Gemara asked, that the intercourse always has some level of pain. But in regard to the entirety of the act, in regard to the pleasure that she receives as well, this pain is null. And that's the reason why when it comes to Oines, it's obviously not null. She was forced into having the relations, therefore you have to pay for that pain. But when it comes to mefuta, when it comes to seduction, because she agreed it was consensual, therefore that level of pain does not have to be paid. And we continue in the Gemara about 10 lines from the wide lines, the two dots. The Mishnah said that if someone violates the woman, you have to pay the 50 shekel kesef right away, the kanas, whereas by the mefuta, when you send her away. Asked the Gemara, Ishtahi. As we saw from the continuation of the Mishnah, the din is if someone is mefata a woman, he has to marry her. So what do you mean when you send her away, you pay 50 shekel kesef? You have a din to marry her. The halacha is when you don't marry her, then you pay the fine. Even though they said that if someone is mafata, pays the fine only when he doesn't marry her, but he has to pay the humility and the depreciation right away. And whether it's forceful, whether it's consensual, she or her father can prevent the marriage. Meaning, the husband has a chiyuv to marry this girl in the case of pitoy. But if she does not want, he cannot force her. He has an obligation to marry her, like the Mishnah said. If she is lame and blind and boils, he has to marry her. But if she doesn't want it, or her father does not want it, then they are allowed to say no. Explains the Gemara. Let's go into this last thing that we just said, 5 lines from the wide lines. It makes sense in the case of mefuta that what? Either she or her father can reject the marriage, because it says in the pasuk says if refusing, the father is going to refuse. How do we know she herself could refuse? But in the case of Aines, in the case of forceful relations, I understand that she could protest and she could say, I don't want to marry this man. In her das. And where do we know that when it comes to Aines, the father as well could block the marriage? Amar Abaye, says Abaye in the first white line, it's a svara, says Abaye. This man violated this woman. This man forced her to have relations, and now he's going to be the chayte, he's the sinner, and niskar. He's going to gain that he's going to be able to marry her against everyone's will. Says Abaye, therefore not only could she say no to the marriage, her father as well has that right. And Rava Amar Kal V'Chaimer, it's a Kal V'Chaimer. Oma mifata shlover el al das avia bilvad. When in the case of Mifuta, what happened? She only went. In the case of Mefata, let's play out this action. We have a man, we have a woman, he seduces her to have relations. So it's consensual. So in whose regard did this man violate? He didn't violate her because she agreed. But he violated the will of this girl's father. So then, and what's the halacha? Yet, beini bein aviyah chol ma'akiv. Anyone can protest. Oine she'avar al das aviyah ve'al das atzma. In the case of Oine, she violated two knowledges, the father and the girl. L'kol shekein, certainly both the father and the girl can prevent the marriage. And now we have two opinions. We had Rav and Abaye. Abaye said choytin ischar. Rav said kal v'chaymer. So now in the classical game of ping pong, Rav l'amar kabaye. Why doesn't Rav say like Abaye choytin ischar? Kim to come mishalim kenas lav choytin ischar. Says Rava, he's not gaining. He has to pay a kanas, so it's not a case of the sinner gaining. Abaye lamar karava mifatam. In the case of seduction, Teiu matim akiv, avia nami matim akiv. Oines Teiu loy matim akiv, avia nami lo matim akiv. So says Abaye, not necessarily do we have the kavachaymer of Rava. Says Abaye, in the case of mifate, since the ilhu matim akiv, he is able to prevent the marriage. Therefore, avianami matim akiv. But in the case of Oines, where ihu, the violator himself, loy matim akiv, therefore the father also cannot. And we'll end off. We'll stop over here. We'll pick up from Tani Idach in the next year. Amir Tzashem.